A missile explodes in the middle of a desert thousands of miles away. But the people who ordered it are sitting safely in air-conditioned rooms on the other side of the planet. Soldiers fight, cities burn, and headlines scream about war, yet the two most powerful rivals involved never officially declare war on each other. Strange, right? Because this is the reality of modern conflict. In today's world, nations rarely fight each other directly. Instead, they fight through someone else. And that silent battlefield has a name: the proxy war. Now, before we go deeper, if you enjoy strategic history, global power struggles, and hidden geopolitics explained in simple terms, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. Here on the Strategic Arsenal, we break down the world's most complex conflicts so you can understand what's really happening behind the headlines. A proxy war is one of the most dangerous and misunderstood forms of conflict. Two powerful countries want to weaken each other, but they avoid fighting directly because the cost would be catastrophic. Instead, they support smaller countries, rebel groups, militias, or governments that fight on their behalf. Weapons, money, intelligence, training, all of it flows quietly behind the scenes. And while global powers play their strategic game, the real battlefield becomes someone else's homeland. The idea of proxy wars isn't new, but it became extremely powerful during the Cold War, when the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a global rivalry. Both superpowers had nuclear weapons, and a direct war could have destroyed the entire planet. So instead of fighting each other head-on, they turned dozens of countries into indirect battlegrounds. One of the most famous examples happened in Vietnam. On one side, the United States supported South Vietnam. On the other side, the Soviet Union and China supported North Vietnam. Officially, America wasn't fighting the Soviet Union. But in reality, both superpowers were pouring resources into the conflict. Weapons, funding, training, and military advisors shaped the war behind the scenes. For the Vietnamese people, however, the result was devastating. Millions of lives were lost, cities were destroyed, and the country became the front line of a global rivalry. Another powerful example was Afghanistan in the 1980s. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, the United States saw an opportunity. Instead of sending American troops directly to fight Soviet forces, the U.S. supported Afghan resistance fighters known as the Mujahideen. Money, weapons, and intelligence flowed through secret channels. One of the most famous weapons supplied was the Stinger missile, which allowed fighters to shoot down Soviet helicopters and aircraft. From Washington's perspective, the strategy worked. The Soviet Union eventually withdrew from Afghanistan after years of costly fighting. But proxy wars often create long-term consequences. The region was left unstable, armed groups remained powerful, and the conflict planted seeds that would shape global politics for decades. The reason proxy wars are so appealing to powerful countries is simple. They reduce direct risk. If two nuclear powers fought each other openly, the consequences could be unimaginable. But when the fighting happens through intermediaries, governments can deny direct involvement while still pursuing their strategic goals. Another advantage is cost. Fighting a war directly requires huge numbers of soldiers, massive logistics, and political support at home. But supporting a proxy group is much cheaper. A shipment of weapons, intelligence support, and funding could keep a conflict going for years without sending a single official soldier into battle. However, proxy wars come with a dangerous problem. Once a conflict begins, controlling it becomes extremely difficult. Local groups have their own agendas. Governments may support them for strategic reasons, but those groups might pursue goals that create chaos later. The Middle East offers many examples of this complex reality. In Syria, what began as a domestic uprising quickly turned into one of the most complicated proxy wars in modern history. Multiple countries became involved indirectly. The United States supported certain rebel groups. Russia backed the Syrian government. Iran supported militias aligned with the regime. Turkey had its own strategic interests and supported different factions. Suddenly, the conflict was no longer just a civil war. It became a geopolitical chessboard where global powers tested influence, protected allies, and attempted to reshape the region. Each country pursued its own strategy, and the battlefield became incredibly fragmented. For ordinary people living in the region, the consequences were catastrophic. Millions were displaced. Entire cities were destroyed. And the conflict dragged on for years because so many external powers had invested in different sides. Proxy wars also allow powerful nations to test weapons, tactics, and strategies without direct confrontation. Military technology can be evaluated in real combat environments. Intelligence networks gather valuable data, and geopolitical influence expands quietly without triggering a global war. But the darker side of proxy wars is that they often prolong conflicts instead of ending them. When outside powers continue supplying weapons and support, local factions gain the ability to keep fighting longer than they otherwise could. Instead of a short conflict that eventually ends through negotiation or exhaustion, wars can stretch for years or even decades. Yemen is another example often described as a proxy conflict. Regional powers have supported different sides in the civil war. turning what started as an internal political struggle into a much larger geopolitical contest. Airstrikes, missile attacks, and humanitarian crises have followed, while global powers watch the strategic balance carefully. And the reality is, proxy wars are not limited to the past. They are happening right now in different parts of the world. Sometimes they involve governments, sometimes militias, sometimes private military groups. The actors may change, but the strategy remains the same: influence the battlefield without fighting directly. There's also a psychological dimension to proxy warfare. By supporting allies indirectly, governments can maintain plausible deniability. Officially, they may claim they are only providing humanitarian aid, defensive equipment, or training. But behind closed doors, the real strategic objective is often much bigger. For intelligence agencies, proxy wars create opportunities to shape global events quietly. Covert operations, secret funding channels, and hidden alliances become powerful tools. Some operations remain classified for decades, only becoming public years later when documents are finally released. Another reason proxy wars persist is domestic politics. Leaders often face pressure from voters who are tired of large military deployments overseas. Supporting proxy forces allows governments to influence conflicts while avoiding the political cost of sending large numbers of soldiers into combat zones. But there is a major ethical dilemma here. When powerful countries compete through proxy wars, the people who suffer most are usually those living in the conflict zone. Families lose homes, infrastructure collapses. Entire generations grow up surrounded by instability. And yet, from the perspective of global strategy, proxy wars are seen as a safer alternative to direct confrontation. In a world where nuclear weapons still exist, many policymakers believe indirect conflict is the only way to compete without risking global catastrophe. The modern battlefield is evolving even further. Today, proxy warfare can include cyber attacks, economic pressure, disinformation campaigns, and technological support. Instead of just weapons and fighters, influence can spread through digital networks, intelligence operations, and financial systems. Some analysts even argue that the future of warfare will rely more on indirect competition than traditional military battles. Artificial intelligence, drones, cyber capabilities, and remote technologies could make it easier for powerful nations to shape conflicts without direct involvement. But the core idea remains the same. Two rivals compete for power and influence while someone else becomes the battlefield. Understanding proxy wars is essential if we want to understand modern geopolitics. When news headlines report a conflict somewhere in the world, the visible fighting is often only part of the story. Behind the scenes, alliances, funding, weapons, and strategic interests may reveal a much larger global contest. And that's exactly what we explore here on the Strategic Arsenal, breaking down the hidden strategies shaping our world so you can see the bigger picture behind global events. Because once you start looking closely, you realize that many conflicts are not just local struggles. They are pieces of a much larger geopolitical puzzle where powerful nations compete quietly, carefully avoiding direct war while still pushing their interests forward. And here's something interesting to think about. If proxy wars are meant to prevent large global conflicts, are they actually keeping the peace? Or are they simply moving the battlefield somewhere else? Because while superpowers avoid direct confrontation, the cost is often paid by the regions caught in the middle. Now, I want to hear your thoughts. Do you think proxy wars reduce the chances of a global war? Or do they make conflicts more complicated and dangerous? Drop your opinion in the comments below because discussions like this help everyone understand the bigger picture. And if you found this breakdown valuable, share this video with someone who wants to understand how global power really works. Conversations like these help spread awareness about the strategies shaping our world. Subscribe to the Strategic Arsenal for more deep dives into geopolitics, military strategy, and the hidden forces driving global events. Because the more you understand the game of power, the clearer the world begins to look.